Professor Ted, welcome to CGTN. You are a sinologist specializing in Taoist philosophies. I wonder, when you talk to your friends and family back home, how would you describe exactly what is it that you do and why you love it so much?
That's a question I get a lot, and sometimes people are a little confused of why I would study something so obscure. Let me first clarify. We can start with the first line of the classic, the earliest classic of Taoism, which is the Tao Te Ching, also known probably more commonly in English as Tao Te Ching. I also refer to it by the name of the author or the supposed author, Lao Tzu. The first line says, "The Tao that can be Tao is not the eternal or constant Tao." This kind of statement is very confusing, and part of what I think is fun about Taoism is there's a lot of wordplay, paradox, inverting our sense of normal ideas. And so it can be quite good at shaking up our ways of thinking, so we can be inspired to think about our lives or the world in a new way. So then how do I explain, I study something that you can't talk about, right? That's kind of a fun way to start to introduce what Taoism is.
Take us back to when you were 14 and came across the Tao Te Ching for the very first time. Was it an immediate attraction, or did it develop over time? Did you know at the time it was going to be a whole career?
Well, certainly I didn't know at 14 that it would be a whole career, but there was an immediate attraction. It was also kind of an accident. I mean, I went to the library to do some research for a high school social studies paper, and I was looking at the different books on Eastern religion and philosophy, and there weren't very many in my local library. I was from a fairly small town in the US. So I looked at all of them to see if any of them would be useful for my project. And one of them was the Tao Te Ching. And it was also stood out because the book itself had large photographs and calligraphy, and the layout was very aesthetic. So visually it was quite gripping. But then also, once I started reading it, I thought, this is really different. This is something I've never encountered before. But at the same time, it felt like, oh, this feels familiar, or feels kind of in line with some of the things I value and I think about. For example, I grew up in a pretty rural place in Western Massachusetts, and I enjoyed my time in my youth in the forest, in the mountains, and being close to the natural world and to appreciate the harmonious, living existence of that kind of environment. And then in Taoism, there's this very sophisticated way of articulating human relationship to the cosmos that seemed to resonate with me. And I took out the book from the library and I brought it with me to school. So even in the middle of class, I was reading the Tao Te Ching when the teacher was talking. And so it did grip me right away. And so the next year, I was very fortunate to be able to study Chinese language in my high school.
You're one of the younger sinologists that I know, and you just told us about this beautiful accident, if you will, that got you hooked with the Tao Te Ching. Do you think today's high schoolers and college kids would maybe also come across Tao Te Ching in a similar way when they're not so preoccupied with short videos, TikTok, and social media?
Well, how would they encounter it? Maybe not in a similar way. I mean,
because people don't go to libraries
People don't go to physical libraries. I mean, part of what I actually think is sad about the digital world we live in is exactly these kinds of experiences where you go to the library, there are all these books, and you can just pick one, right? Because they're organized by topic. Of course, you can have accidental encounters on the internet, and that can also be exciting and inspiring. And so maybe that's what would happen in this generation. They would, see a video about Taoism, or they might have some other kind of entry point. So it won't be necessarily the same experience or the same point of contact, but you just need one moment, right? To have these moments of inspiration or surging of curiosity, the form of the media doesn't really matter.
It comes around back to how you promote Tao Te Ching or Taoism. I mean, you wear many hats now. You're a researcher, you're a professor, you head of a global research center that is tasked with increasing the awareness, the understanding, and the exchange culturally, how are you reaching out to a wider and larger audience here?
Well, I'm talking to you today, so that's one way to reach out through mass media. My interest is actually not so much in reaching out, though I think I have to learn that, as you said, how to incorporate that task into what I'm doing. I'm interested in, as I said again, bringing different people together, and then the question is, how do you find those people? How do those people find you? How do you create a global network of scholars and maybe even, artists or writers who have this point of contact, the same interest in this one classic and its ideas and its philosophy? And so media is important just so people are aware that, we can come together with this center, right? This provides a platform for people to interact with each other across languages, across cultural boundaries, national boundaries. I don't know if I consider it promotion. I think it's outreach, right? It's like, how do we reach out to more people to connect them? Because again, there's not the awareness that, we have this point of shared interest.
I guess the lessons from that is that teachings are just as important as promotions. When you want more people to know what Taoism is all about, you now run a research center, the Global Exegetics Research Center at Nankai University. What is it that you do, and how are you promoting your findings to a larger audience?
Why do I use this name, Global Exegetics? Global is a perspective, but it's also a reality. This classic is now a global classic, or a classic of all humanity. And over many years, I searched through the world and went to, through the internet or in person, going to libraries, to find all the different translations in all the languages. This book is translated and published over and over again. Every year, the numbers increase quite quickly. But over 2,052 translations in 97 different languages, which is an incredible quantity of translations for one book, right? It's probably the second most translated book in history. I would argue that what makes something a classic is not that it was written a long time ago, but it's that in every generation, people say, this is still valuable to me. Like for me personally, I was just, a 14-year-old kid in America, and I read this 2,500-year-old book that came from China, and I said, this is relevant to me now in 20th century America. That's what makes it a classic. Or you have famous people who will read the classic, but which version did they read? Whose understanding did they encounter that then inspired them? For example, there's the famous author in Russia, Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy is a big fan of the Tao Te Ching. But so then if we want to understand why was he a fan of the Tao Te Ching, he wasn't reading in Chinese. Whose version did he like? Whose Tao Te Ching inspired him, right? So there are lots of these historical encounters to be studied, right? I mean, it's actually quite a huge topic.
What would you say accounts for the prevalence and popularity of Tao Te Ching and Taoism globally, especially in the West? Because there are entire books that are dedicated to studying the wisdom of Taoism, books like Change Your Thoughts, Change Your Life. There's that song by George Harrison of the Beatles, The Inner Light, that drew inspiration from Taoism. Why has Tao Te Ching and Taoist philosophies been so popular in the West?
It's a great question, and that's part of what we're trying to research. And I'd say it's not just popular in the West, though I do think that because it became popular in the West, that helped it spread more globally. A lot of places have read versions in English and then translated into, for example, the Thai language, or as I said before, Persian, and it's not always direct from China. I think the language grabs people, and it's very simple, but it's also very confusing or very intriguing. And that was my experience, right? When I was 14, I said,
it doesn't make any sense. in the beginning.
Well, but no, but see, it did make sense. If it didn't make any sense, I wouldn't want to engage with it. I mean, there are lots of great works of philosophy, most great works of philosophy. If a regular person would read them, it doesn't make any sense. It's too complex, it's too technical, and requires too much training to even understand what is being said. But the Tao Te Ching is very simple in its language, but because of the way that it's constructed, that simple language is transmitting very complex ideas.
A fun fact that many people may not know is that Lao Tzu and Socrates lived roughly 100 years apart. How would you compare Taoist philosophies to Western philosophies? Are there common elements that are their biggest features?
Yes, I mean, I think that the common elements are the origin of philosophy itself, which is the big questions. What is the universe? What is the origin of the universe? What is our place as humans in this strange world that we are born into? How do humans interact? What is a good way to create society or political organization? These are some of the very basic questions of philosophy, which Lao Tzu is interested in and Socrates is interested in. Socrates also has a famous statement that's something along the lines of, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything. And so he's expressing a kind of, you could say, humility or in awe at the nature of the world, that things are so complex and amazing that he realizes as a limited human, he has to accept the limits of his knowledge. And in the Tao Te Ching, there is this sense, again, with this question of the Tao, you can't even talk about it. Or another famous Taoist philosopher, Zhuangzi, he talks about that knowledge is infinite, but my lifespan is finite. I could never actually understand everything, right? And to try to do that is insanity. So there's a humility, I think, in both the Socratic tradition and the Taoist tradition about humans' capacity to understand the universe, but at the same time, there's a great desire to connect to something bigger than just our individual selves.
We often see quotes from Taoism in popular media, movies, and TV series. Politicians and diplomats like to quote Taoism to enlist the wisdom of the Taoist philosophies. What are some of the most memorable quotes for you?
The famous case that I think of is the US President Ronald Reagan, and he quoted from the Tao Te Ching in one of his State of the Unions. This is the address the US President gives every year. And he said, to govern a great country is like to cook a small fish, right? Again, strange, like a bit paradoxical language. What does cooking a fish have to do with governing a country? To run a big country, you can't poke at the fish too much. If it's a small fish, you need to have it be a small intervention, right? He was promoting a kind of liberalist political philosophy using the Tao Te Ching. Or we have another case, Ban Ki-moon, who was the former Secretary General of the UN. I can't remember the exact event, but he went and visited Obama when Obama was president, and he presented him with 4 characters in Chinese, which was Shang Shan Ruo Shui, right? The highest good is like water. This is from chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching, because it represents his values and his ideals, that to real goodness is somehow connected to water. And this goes back to what I mentioned before, that softness and weakness, according to the Tao Te Ching, are somehow superior to other ways of being. And so the highest good is like water. As a diplomat, I mean, if you think about diplomacy is all about being soft and negotiating these very delicate relationships. Diplomacy is very rarely blunt force. It's about working with the other side and trying to find space to get along. Even if you're not getting along very much, you're still being very sensitive to the different sides. And that's a softness, right? So for a diplomat to suggest this, or the UN Secretary General, there's some logic to that. But it's very fascinating that that's what he grabbed onto for his own sort of slogan.
Academic and cultural exchanges are such an important aspect of China-US relations, but the fact is there are a lot more people in China that study American culture than the other way around. Professor, would you like to see more people in America take up an interest, not necessarily in Taoism, but in other elements of Chinese culture?
Well, of course, I'm most interested in Taoism, so I think everyone should read the Tao Te Ching. But I think what's most important is human exchange, human interaction, direct interaction. Of course, often to get to that point, you need some other influence or inspiration. Like for me, I wouldn't have ever come to China if I hadn't encountered the Tao Te Ching. And so maybe the first stage is some kind of cultural awareness. But I think travel, to back and forth, meeting people in person is very valuable and probably the most valuable thing. And in the past, we've had things like ping pong diplomacy. And is that because ping pong is somehow the magic thing that gets people to communicate in a harmonious way? No, it's just because people coming together and interacting in a very human way is powerful for promoting harmony, for promoting understanding. And so I would actually probably encourage travel more than cultural exchange, though cultural exchange is valuable as well. And I think part of what I want to do with my center is to encourage exchange, but also to encourage awareness of cultural exchange. Everyone I communicate with around the world, they love the Tao Te Ching. I mean, they could be in Germany, or they could be in Thailand, or in Russia, or in Venezuela, anywhere. And we all are connected through this one book, right? That can function as a way of bringing all different kinds of people together. And to me, that's quite powerful.
We talked about the power of softness in diplomacy, and this year marks the 45th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and the US. Is there a Taoist wisdom that we can learn to push this relationship forward?
Certainly. The Tao Te Ching is definitely interested in questions of human relations and politics. Even though it's very short, it's only 5,000 words in Chinese, it touches on a lot of topics, right? And one of those topics is politics, but also the principles it discusses, which are very abstract, are applicable to many different parts of life, including international relations, right? I'm not an expert in international relations, but we can think about, for example, softness and weakness overcoming hardness and strength. How do we apply that to international relations? Or there's another great quote from the Tao Te Ching, which is, if you don't trust others enough, they will not be trustworthy, right? And when you have a relationship, especially complicated relationship, trust is very fundamental. So how do you create trust? I think the normal inclination for humans, right, from Lao Tzu's time to our time, is you first have to prove that you're trustworthy, and then I will trust you. And Lao Tzu says, no, first you treat them as though they are trustworthy, and because of that, they will behave and be trustworthy towards you because you're showing them respect.
When you hear that and then trust and verify, both types of wisdom put trust first. You're going to have to start with trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you invert trust but verify and say verify and then trust, that's not what Lao Tzu is saying. I'm not sure Ronald Reagan was inspired by the Tao Te Ching to have this statement, trust but verify. But we saw the results of that approach, which was a more harmonious interaction with his counterpart in the Soviet Union. So will Lao Tzu solve all the problems in the world? No. It only has 5,000 words. There's a lot of complicated issues humanity faces and will continue to face. But the wisdom, I mean, I've studied this now for 30 years, and I still find it relevant to many things I never thought it would be relevant to. So yes, in the cultural exchange between different countries, I encourage everyone to read the Tao Te Ching.
Professor, could we end with your favorite quote from the Tao Te Ching of those 5,000 words?
Yes.
There's got to be a couple that you think of often.
I've mentioned a few of them already. I could mention one from chapter 77, which is, the way of heaven is like drawing a bow. The high is brought low and the low is brought high. So if you think about drawing a bow, it's kind of hard to do in a suit, but you pull on the bow and then the top of the bow bends because the two sides bend to the middle as the string gets farther out this way. So the way of heaven is like the drawing of a bow, which means it's a moving towards equilibrium, right? Instead of what is ever high or powerful or wealthy is going to get more powerful, more wealthy, and what is ever weak and poor will get lower and lower. You can use this for interpretation in terms of relations with power or economics or various things, but that there's a tendency, the cosmic tendency is to try to have things move towards the middle, but not have them be exactly the same.
Professor Ted, what an insightful conversation. It's a pleasure to have you on CGT, and thank you so much.
It's my pleasure too, thank you.